Dexterity has some of the weirdest design choices in Elden Ring. Recently I ran a poll and it seems like most players agree that it's Arcane, with Dexterity coming in second with about 22% of the vote. In total, Arcane and Dex cover over 80% of the poll, but Arcane is nearly 3 times higher. So then why would I think Dexterity is weirder than Arcane? And why did it get so many votes in the first place? Well, this is probably a result of the fact that Dexterity is the only stat that has expectations that aren't really met, and yet specialize in things that feel a bit off. So what is weird about Dexterity? Well, I'll tell you. The confusion of Arcane, the skills and mechanics, the lack of incantation or spells, the inclusion of lightning damage, and the weapon design and progression. In previous videos, I've already mentioned the discrepancy between getting the confusion of Arcane and Dexterity, but simply put, despite the expectation of bleed poison builds along with assassin-like mechanics, speedy moves, being dexterous, this niche actually belongs to Arcane. Yes, in previous Souls game, bleed weapons were dex and luck based. While this is not necessarily weird, it does confuse a lot of new players and even Souls veterans. It is no surprise that Arcane did take this niche, as they did kind of consolidate a lot of stats to make a greater variety of builds possible. And for people who don't know, luck was the equivalent of Arcane in the Dark Souls games. So what would you expect out of a Dexterity build? Let's look at Ashes of War and skills, right? So which one of these is a Dexterity Ash of War? Take your time, I'm not going to rush you. If you said Eliona's polearm, or if you said the Black Knife, then you're wrong. If you said Blide's weapon, I don't even know. It's a Godslayer Greatsword. I know you're going to have some people who are going to say, no, this is a Faith weapon. The thing is, you only build Faith up till like either level 25 or 30, and that's to get the buffs. This skill's so much better on Dexterity, it's ridiculous. Yeah, this Spiral Club of a Greatsword that you swing around with what appears to be a lot of force and deal incredible amounts of physical and fire damage is a Dex weapon. And although this might be an extreme example, this is a very common theme you're going to see with Dex weapons that aren't Bullet Ashes of War. Everything from Lightning Slash, Lightning Ram, Queen's Black Flame, and Dragonlord's Cragblade, Thundercloud Form. They're not bad. They're not. They're incredibly good. But how do any of these fit the expectation of being dexterous? And these Dex weapons are relatively cheap on FP, meaning that it gives you the ability to build more vigor and more endurance. And a lot of times, in order to get them off, you're going to need to build a lot of poise, so you're going to be seeing them wear the Lionel's armor, or Radahn's armor, or even more commonly, the Bull Goat set. And most Dex-focused skills that don't fill this niche are almost caster-like in nature. These are called Bullet Ashes of War, and as much as I like to smite my foes, or Fus Rodah my enemies, it does feel like these skills were meant for a different stat. It's not like we could have had anything different and more thematically appropriate. In Dark Souls 3, you have the quill darts from the Pro Quills, which would fit the Dex theme much better than, let's say, yelling at an opponent to kill them. That feels something more like a barbarian thing to do. The only two Ashes of War that fit the Dex theme incredibly well is the Bloodhound's Fang and Waterfowl Dance from the Hand of Melania. And the Waterfowl Dance feels very similar to that first category, where you just kind of put yourself in a position where you build enough poise and tank through hits. As a disclaimer, I know there's plenty of Keen Ashes of War that are strike with weapon. The problem is, other stats use those better. If it strikes with weapon, if it's not a Bullet Ash of War, and it's not from a Somber weapon, it could be used on a different stat. The Keen Affinity is not good. If you're power stancing, you're better off going occult. If you're two-handing a weapon, then you may as well go heavy. And so that's why I'm going to be excluding things like Spinning Slash or Impale and Thrust, because the only time that's going to be doing more damage than other options is when you use a lightning affinity and the enemy is weak to lightning. Going back on topic, while a lot of these Dex Ashes of War incentivize you taking the hit, Dex does not boost defense. In fact, out of all stats, and this kind of makes it weird again, it is the only one that doesn't boost defense outside of debatably Mind. So Vigor is going to get you fire resistance, Strength, all physical resistance, Endurance, it may not seem like it gives you resistance, but it does because it helps you build armor. Intelligence gives you magic resistance. Faith, you may not think it gives you resistance, but it does give you incredibly broken defensive buffs, going anywhere between 30 to 65% damage reduction. And Arcane gives you holy resistance. And Dexterity, it does give you some damage reduction. It decreases fall damage barely, and in times in which it really doesn't matter. In fact, Dex has very little combat boosting potential for itself, making it somewhat of an outlier. A lot of the passive effects for Dexterity are more supplementary than anything else, and they're all over the place. Now, I will admit, the cast-like skills, despite being bizarre for Dex, really does help it out, and it's almost justified. Dex is the only stat without a catalyst, but going back to the passive, Dex does increase casting speed, and that's probably the reason why they don't have a catalyst. They don't have a Sacred Seal, and they do not have a Glintstone Staff. No. I'm not going to count the Frenzy Flame Seal because that scales so poorly, it doesn't matter. It's garbage. It does seem like they made up for the lack of casting abilities with caster like Ashes of War. You could also attempt to make the argument that, hey, yeah, Dexterity increases casting speed, so it's at least somewhat viable for casting builds. And if you're building Moonveil, sure. Problem is, there is one talisman that boosts your casting speed worth 30 levels of Dex with no other cost. And this is not like a multiplier like weight loads or anything like that. No, it is straight up here's this much plus 30. With no other cost, making Dex investment insultingly slow in comparison. Now, casting speed benefits spells such as Glintstone Pebble, Hone Bolt, and other non-charge abilities. It also doesn't really benefit abilities with long animation, so if it doesn't seem to make a difference, you're probably using the wrong spell, though the difference is still small though. Honestly, it is a bit funny and a bit weird that the Unga Bunga stat is a much better spellcasting stat than the one that focuses on skill and finesse. Like, I'm going to be real here. What Dex really does well in is Ashes of War and lightning damage. And lightning damage bothered plenty of Faith players, as it was something that they were expecting in previous games. As it was something they were expecting as a result of previous games, specifically Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls 2. Thematically, it works with Dex, but it also works with Faith, and honestly, it came as an expectation. And it was split with Faith, sort of. With higher Faith requirements making Lightning Faith builds feasible, but dissatisfying, as in order to use the weapons, you need a lot of Dexterity. In order to use the spells and the incantations, you're going to need to build Faith. And with no talismans at scale of Dex, honestly, it does kind of feel like a waste building it, as you're going to have to overlevel to level 220 to make it viable. A lot of people who played Faith and have never ran anything else might think that Dex builds are great, they're fantastic, and they're very powerful. The thing is, they aren't. And as I mentioned earlier, people do confuse Dex builds with arcane builds. So let's look at the most Dex-leaning bleed weapons. And I'm talking about Rivers of Blood and Eliona's Polearm. Here's the numbers you get. About a 5% increase in damage and a 50% increase in bleed proc between Dex and Arcane. And this also opens up the room for them to build incantations and sorceries. And yes, they have the best talisman in the game, as well as one of the best Glintstone Staves. Occult is going to outcompete both Keen and Bleed in terms of damage. And when you want to look at the claw weapons, the Bloodhound's Claw with heavy scaling is going to scale much better and much faster than the Raptor's Talons. And you can also infuse that with Bloodflame Blade, making it just the better option. So no, Dex is not going to be your bleed build. Maybe early on, when you get Bloody Slash, you can run it for a short period of time. But by the time you hit mid-game, you're now suboptimal, and you're going to keep on underperforming. I'm going to go ahead and leave a AR calculator just so you can check out the numbers yourself. You do not necessarily need to believe everything I'm saying. Just go ahead, try it, try to theorycraft a new build because I would love to see it. What I'm getting at is outside of somber weapons, Dexterity really does kind of need the lightning damage because it does give him something unique and something to actually work with. I've already had a video on this previously. There's one thing I did gloss over. There is another early game weapon you get, and that is the Guardian Sword Spear. It's a 2% drop from these guys right here. It's a fantastic for a Keen build. Honestly, it's the only other option they have early on in the game. In fact, let's talk about progression. The progression for Dex builds is weird, and I do apologize. I was ripping a Dex quite a bit. And I honestly do think it is the worst stat in Elden Ring, but it does have a few perks. Specifically, it has one of the best early game weapons. In fact, scratch that, the best early game, mid game weapon, and it just scales all the way through to New Game Plus. And that is the Bloodhound's Fang. It is pretty solid, and it typically outperforms all other non-colossal weapons in the game, including the Scale Sword. That's because the weapon's few buffs and a lot of other scything it kind of gets, including jump attack bonuses, as well as Bloodhound's Finesse. Going back to the category of progression, you get these weapons incredibly early on, like Weeping Peninsula and killing the Bloodhound Knight. But then when is your next weapon? Well, you really don't get another weapon up until midway approaching the end of the game. At least one that is good and optimal to use. And those two weapons are going to be either the Bolt of Grandsax or Morgoth's Greatsword. Now let's compare to strength, but this is true with the other stats. Strength usually goes, you get the Claymore, you get the Grafted Greatsword, you get the Greatsword, you get the Giant Crusher and the Star Scourge Greatsword, and then you get the Axe of Godfrey. All evenly spaced out, and optimal for what you're using them for. In all the other stats, you kind of get this level of progression in a way that you have in regular intervals. You get try out a new flavor, a new thing to try out. Now, this is a blessing and a curse. I know that people think that Bloodhound's Fang is a noob weapon, and in a way, it kind of is, but there's really no other options to go. And this is probably the reason why you don't see people who build Bloodhound's Fang try anything else out, because there is really nothing to try out until mid to late game. Within this video, I was dissing Dex a lot, and honestly, I do love the stat. I think it's a really fun stat. Bloodhound's Fang is, in my opinion, the best weapon in the game. I love it. The biggest thing is, as I mentioned throughout the entire video, it doesn't work how people want it to, or how people think it should. It works by Ashes of War, and oftentimes these Ashes of War are slow, and they hit really hard. They feel more appropriate for a strength build or a faith build. And things that feel like they should be dex-based aren't. I mentioned Arcane, but also, remember the Black Knife? Yes, technically that has decent on-hit scaling for dex build, but it's not that good. It's not good enough. After all, that's a faith weapon. The Ash of War scales exclusively on faith, and that is the main appeal of that weapon. When I say that dex is a weird stat, it's just the fact that its design is all over the place. It doesn't feel like it's dexterity. It feels like it's something else. It feels like it's good. Like, I like it. It's a fun stat to build. But why do I have a stat that's telling me to trade into Melania when it's normally sold as a, hey, you attack fast and dodge? Dark Souls 3 handled dexterity better than Elden Ring, because it did feel unique and it did feel super useful. Everything from Astor's Greatsword to the Cellsor's Twin Blades felt appropriately dexterous as weapons, and honestly, it was really good. Now, was the overall balance of the game good? No, but at least the dex weapons felt dexterous, and they felt they worked the way they should have, and that you would anticipate them to work. Thank you for getting this far in the video. Honestly, if you can, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. This is still considered a relatively new channel, and any help, any like, any subscribe would be greatly appreciated. You guys are all awesome. Thank you for watching this far in. Feel free to disagree with everything I said. This is just my experience playing the game, my theory crafting. Every single time I put in a calculator, this is what I'm finding. Every single time, every single playthrough, and every single run. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If I have any improvements, go ahead and tell me what I can improve on. I would honestly love to hear what you guys have to say. Thank you and have an awesome day.